My name is Kelly Masete, Regional Executive at SAICA. A very warm welcome to you and to our guest, Advocate Eric Mkhawane, CEO of the Office of the Tax Ombud. The office was created together with the introduction of the Tax Administration Act in 2012. The Act was introduced not only to consolidate the administrative provisions of the various pieces of tax legislation in South Africa, but to also strike a balance between the rights and powers between SARS and taxpayers. With this in mind, the Office of the Tax Ombud was created to bring that balance in. Advocate, let's start at the very beginning. In 2013, the Office of the Tax Ombud was launched. Why was that the case, and what was the requirement for the person that was going to run this office?
In the first place, and thanks for having me on this show. Before this office was created, if you had any issue, the only option you had, probably, apart from running to SARS itself, would be to run to court. As you know, that is quite expensive at times. Some issues may not necessarily need that kind of litigation, but it may be an issue where you need somebody independent who can mediate between the taxpayer and SARS. And that's really the reason why this office was established. That's the first thing. And secondly, to also make sure that you protect taxpayer rights. Yes. Taxpayers do have rights, and those rights you have the right to receive reasons for your assessment, for example. But in the absence of this office, you would have to enforce those rights in court, and you don't necessarily have to go to court now. With the establishment of this office. Now, coming to what kind of person would be required, or to occupy this position. I mean, the Act is very specific in that regard. It needs somebody with a very good experience in service and also a very good background of tax. And as you know, the Ombud himself is Judge Bennett Webbe. You cannot get anything better than that. You can never get better than that. He's independent and he's impartial, and is one of the requirements for a person to really serve as an Ombud. So you find a judge who's presided over many cases in his life, and he understands what impartiality means and independence as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Advocate. With this in mind, you now have the Office of the Tax Ombud and the Office of the Public Protector, plus you have SARS' own internal complaints procedures. Now, how would you differentiate between the three?
Okay. First of all, when you look at the SARS internal complaints management office, which is called the CMO, which used to be called the SMO, SSMO. That office resides within SARS, so it's not independent. So that you cannot, if you may not have confidence when you go to that office, you want to complain about SARS, yet you go to SARS. It served its purpose. That's okay. It's now a complaints management office within SARS. So if you do not come right there, that's when you go to the Office of the Tax Ombud. Now here I must emphasize issues of independence. As a Ombud is defined as an independent person, independent and impartial, and dealing with complaints against an agency. So yes, the Tax Ombud is independent. For example, it reports to the minister, so there's no connection with SARS in regard to reporting. And of course is impartial, as a legislation requires of him to be impartial. So that is, you can get comfort when you go to the office of the Tax Ombud because of the independence from SARS. You're not going to SARS to complain against SARS. You're going to an independent person to complain against the conduct of SARS. Now, bearing in mind, it may be something we'll touch on later on. It's the office the mandate is to deal with complaints against, service issues or service-related complaints against SARS, procedural complaints against SARS, and or administrative issues. So that's what the office deal with. But when you go to the public protector looks at maladministration, various abuse of powers, and all those kind of things, but not restricted to SARS, but restricted to any government institution.
Well, given this distinction that you just provided, Advocate, if you were to advise someone about these processes, when should a taxpayer approach the Tax Ombud, and what matters? I think you've touched a bit on some of them in the preceding statement.
Okay. Now, let's start with probably, let me just begin with the process within SARS, because I think this is where sometimes people misunderstand the process. If you have an issue with SARS, first you call the call center, or you go to the branch. You will be required to wait for 21 days, and an answer then must be given. If SARS does not respond with it, if the branch, the call center doesn't come back to you, give you a solution to your issue, then you must lodge a complaint within SARS. And that's where you go to the CMO, the Complaints Management Office. Now, if you do not tell SARS that you are now lodging a complaint, they will not regard it as a complaint. So it's very crucial that you say, I am now lodging a complaint. Even if you're calling the call center, you must just tell them you are now lodging a complaint.
So I have to specify
You have to specify, otherwise they will regard it as a query. I'll tell you why it is important. Because the Act requires somebody who's approaching us it requires that person should have exhausted the SARS internal processes first before they can approach us.
Yes.
So it is very crucial that a person understands they have to make contact with the contact center or the branch firstly, and if they don't get any joy, then lodge a complaint within SARS. And then if they still don't get any joy, that's when they come to us. But I must just emphasize one thing, some complaints by nature may be so urgent that if you are to follow those kind of steps, more harm will be suffered. So the Act makes provision that under certain circumstances, a taxpayer can approach us directly without having to exhaust those internal processes. For example, if the person is facing hardship, and this problem is causing undue hardship, or if he's raising a systemic issue, for example. And furthermore, there's one aspect that I must say, the Act gives us discretion to evaluate the nature of the complaint and to check if we are to expect the taxpayer to follow those processes, whether it will be reasonable or not. The time it will take, whether it will be reasonable or not. So we do have a discretion to accept a complaint that comes directly to us, if we can find any of those elements that I just mentioned. So when a person has exhausted the internal processes, then they can lodge a complaint with us. Or a person has compelling circumstances, they can approach us directly without having to exhaust the internal processes.
Okay. Now, Advocate, at that point when you have just gone through the internal processes of SARS and you've exhausted everything possible, it's at that stage that you approach the Ombud's office. Now, how do you go about that? And how do you then contact the office of the Ombud?
Okay, we have various channels of contacting us. We have a toll-free number. We have a website. A person can go onto the website, but let me just elaborate what is the exact process of lodging a complaint. A person will have to obtain a complaints form, which is available on the website. And for those who don't have the website, who do not have access to that such facilities, they can phone our office on the toll-free number, which will be provided, of course. That we can, our call center can send the person who's requesting the form either by email or by posting, whatever mode that the person wants to use or has access to. So we can make provision in any way. So other people prefer to come to the office. They can call into the office, but obviously it will be people who are local in Gauteng. They can then complete the form when the form is available, upon receiving the form, and send it to us. They can either mail, fax, or even post, whichever way. We do receive such complaints by post as well.
So, Advocate, you mentioned that those that are in Gauteng, closely close proximity to the office here, can easily access your offices. Is there an intention to open offices in the other main centers around the country in the near future? Indeed,
we do plan to do so. Of course, being a new office, we must first establish somewhere and then you can start. And with budget constraints as well, we need to factor that in.
Yes.
When the money permits, we'll be able to roll out
Indeed.
branches.
Do you investigate only the complaints that are lodged by taxpayers, or is there another process that you follow?
Well, we investigate complaints that are lodged by taxpayers. You know, that one is specific, but we also, since January this year, we are able to initiate an investigation, even without a complaint. Now, as you know, or maybe you may well know, that we undertook a systemic investigation into the undue delay in the payment of refunds by SARS.
Yes.
So that one was the initiative that we took, because we realized that if we look on, at cases on a case-by-case basis, we normally don't touch on the underlying issues. So we needed to go beyond a specific complaint and try to see what are the underlying causes, why are they delays in the payment of refunds.
And indeed, Advocate, that was quite a big one, because SAICA also at some point, did become involved and assisted your office with the investigation, especially pertaining to the specific experiences in our various constituencies, as how our members, specifically being our tax practitioners, experience those problems. Now, with that in mind, what role do you think the public on the one hand and stakeholders of the Ombud's office, such as SAICA, have in investigation of this kind of systemic issues?
Well, people shouldn't just sit back and expect the Ombud to know it all. The people who experience difficulties is the public, the practitioners who are dealing with SARS on a regular basis. So each one each one of us has a responsibility towards making sure that we have a fair tax administration system. So you pick up problems, you can play a role. You can alert the Ombud and say, this is the challenge that I'm facing, and it may even be by way of lodging a complaint or by raising the issue with the Ombud. But I must just emphasize that we have seen a trend where people want us to look at other people's tax affairs. It has to be a complaint by the taxpayer on his, in regard to his own tax affairs. I can't lodge a complaint against, SARS on another person's tax affairs. I mean, the law doesn't permit it. Doesn't permit that. It must be a complaint about. So
coming directly from the taxpayer themselves.
That's correct.
I would like us to explore that later, Advocate.
We can explore that later. So, but overall, the role, it's a public's role to make sure that they raise issues. Now, when we do a systemic investigation like this, regarding the delays in the payment of refunds, we expect people as well, people who are having those challenges, to come forward and say, well, I'm also affected. You can't keep quiet and say, well, the Ombud must just come up with answers. Maybe your problem may be unique, or it may be something that we never picked up or we never thought of. Yes. And we want to be able to help, but if you do not help, you do not come up with these issues, we will not be able to help. So where there is a complaint, we'll deal with that complaint and make sure it's resolved.
Yes.
But we'll go beyond that, and see what was the underlying issue. And then in that regard, we can make a recommendation to SARS to say, well, we've picked up, here's a complaint, address this complaint. However, we see this is a systemic issue. It's affecting more people.
Yes.
And please deal with this issue before it becomes a serious problem for many taxpayers.
Yes, thank you. Earlier you mentioned the various matters that may be dealt with through your office, such as procedural issues, amongst others. To the men on the street out there, can you please elaborate, maybe by way of an example, in terms of what are those specific issues that one may be able to approach the office with?
Okay. Now, maybe let me use a typical example, of one of the matters that we dealt with. A taxpayer received an assessment and then requested reasons for assessment. Now, you expect a response when you receive or when you request such reasons. Now, if SARS does not provide you with reasons, it's a service. They have not provided you with a service. They have not given you the service that you require. If you write to SARS, you expect SARS to respond. So it's a service issue. SARS goes ahead now, because there's a debt, you request a suspension of payment. You know that there's a pay now and argue later principle. So if you do not request a suspension of payment, you are not able to get protection. So when you request that suspension of payment, you expect an answer.
Yes.
Now, if SARS acts and goes ahead and collect
in spite of your request,
yes, and have not responded to your request, administratively it's not correct.
Yes.
It's a wrong process.
Okay.
So they should respond first.
Yes.
Before SARS can take the next step. It must respond to your request. Now, say SARS writes a letter. SARS is required, before it can take money, enforce payment by taking money from your bank account as a taxpayer, for example. They need to have written a letter of final demand. It's required of them in terms of the Tax Administration Act to say, this is the amount that you owe as a taxpayer. That letter of demand must spell out, this is the amount that you owe. What will happen if you don't owe, if you don't pay? And things such as third-party appointment, judgment being taken, whatever enforcement that SARS can, enforcement action SARS can take, it must be spelled out in that.
Yes.
And the third thing that the letter must spell out is that in the event that you are not able to pay, what are your options, or you can, for example, ask for a deferred payment. You can ask, to do a compromise or a settlement. So those are some of the things that must be listed on that letter.
Yes.
So if SARS does not, or the letter does not comply with those requirements as set out in the Tax Administration Act, then they have not followed the right procedure.
And that provides the grounds then for...
Yes, for us to intervene.
Yes.
So it's possible that you may find in one matter all those elements.
Well, Advocate, to go back a bit, we touched on the role that taxpayers can play in these processes. Would you like to indulge us a bit in terms of how your stakeholders, such as RCB, such as SAICA, can assist in these administrative issues?
Well, we actually value input from all walks. And I must just emphasize, bodies like SAICA, SAIPA, SAIT, and the like, they play a crucial role. They represent the tax-paying community, of course. So they deal with the revenue service on a daily basis. They know the ins, they know the outs, and they get to see the problems that taxpayers are experiencing. So it's this office cannot really not function, cannot represent the community at large without recognizing the inputs coming from those bodies. So we would appeal to the recognized bodies to make use of the office. It's no longer, the fact that we went out of our way to make proposal to be able to initiate investigations so that we can have people even raising the issues with us, issues that we can look at. So on our own, we really cannot. We need taxpayers to complain. We need the bodies, the recognized bodies to bring issues. There may be systemic issues in nature. They may not be accompanied by complaint. But if a person raises an issue, say, look, we have this specific problem and it looks like it's an emerging issue, please look at it. Then we are able to look into it. As you know, I must say for the benefit of the public and the viewers that this initiative to conduct a systemic investigation has to get the approval of the minister. And I can just say that that's what the Act requires, that we do. We get the approval from the minister. It may be one of the shortcomings that we may have to address in future, that the Ombud should be able to decide on which issues without having to seek approval of the minister in future.
Well, that's another interesting point of conversation, Advocate, that maybe we can talk about also at some point. I would just like to go back, touch a bit on the complaints process. Once a taxpayer has lodged a complaint, how long does the process normally take?
Well, we may give ourselves targets, you know. I mean, I
Yes.
must emphasize, when we started the office, we thought, let's say 15 working days and see how it goes. And in some, we are able to do so, and some matters may be very complex in nature. So it's very difficult at this stage, you know, to can tell the taxpayer it will take this much. And you know, when you establish an office, you establish with something in mind. You'll make mistakes somewhere you actually later on you get it right. We still have those teething problems. In some instances, we'll make a recommendation, and that recommendation may well be implemented by SARS within few days. But some recommendations you make, and you find that SARS may not have answers.
Yes.
And it may depend on obtaining a legal opinion from counsel, and that takes a while. So it really differs. You know, some matters may be very quick, maybe a matter of days, 3 days, 4 days, 15 days, 10 days. Some matters may take as long as 3 months or even 4 months.
So it is case specific.
It's case specific, depends on the complexity of the matter.
I know that during the natural course of this process, some of the cases may be rejected by the Tax Ombud. Now, obviously, there are some misconceptions that the general public out there have. You might want to share on some of those cases and what circumstances and what are those misconceptions perhaps that exist out there that you've encountered.
Okay. First, maybe going back to the process that we follow. If a complaint comes to us, we first have to check whether it falls within our mandate or not. If it does, if it does not fall within our mandate, we'll tell the taxpayer straight away. It does not fall within our mandate. We are a statutory body. We are only limited to service, procedural, administrative complaints. Now, then it's the end of the matter. It's, you know. And then the other thing is that sometimes it may fall within our mandate, but the question is, has the person exhausted the SARS internal processes?
Yes.
Now, where the person has not exhausted the SARS internal processes, and as I've said before, that the person, if in that case, the person has to provide compelling circumstances.
Yes.
And if there are no compelling circumstances, we have to reject it. Maybe it's a very harsh word to use. I'd like a milder word. Perhaps we should be parking it and saying to the taxpayer, yes, the matter falls within our mandate, but you have not exhausted these internal processes and you have not provided us with compelling circumstances. Either the taxpayer can come back to us and tell us it's got compelling circumstances, or can try to exhaust the SARS internal processes first, in which case they must come back to us if SARS still has not resolved the matter. So sometimes matters that are coming to us prematurely, we'll say, well, look, first go and exhaust the SARS internal processes. And that is most of the time some of the issues. Now, we can't talk about the mandate without talking about the limitations of the mandate.
Yes.
Because that leads to a lot of rejections. A person has to check whether the complaint does not, whether it falls within the limitations. Because the limitations are the objections and appeals. We cannot deal with the merits of the objections and appeals. It's one of the limitations. So that may result in a matter being rejected. You know, you find a lot of people coming to say, I don't agree with this assessment. Now, by so doing, you're saying you really would be required to object to the assessment. So some people think that any issue they have, they can come to the office of the Tax Ombud. So they never check whether it falls within the limitations or not. So that's where the problem lies. So a matter that is before court also is That's one of the limitations. And somebody, for example, says, no, I don't agree with this section. We cannot deal with that. It falls within our limitation. So you may find these are the issues that really require a lot of education, a lot of understanding, and some people really want to replace the objection and appeals route with the office of the Tax Ombud. And there's a very serious danger in that, because when it comes to objections and appeals, there are time frames. If you throw in a complaint with us, which is you're supposed to object to, you run the risk of running out of time. When by the time we come back to you and say, no, it does not fall within our mandate.
That window has closed.
That window has closed. So people really need to be making sure that if it's a matter that they can object, they must do so. And because then in the process, they are protecting themselves and they are able to avoid running the risk of being out of time.
I'm an advocate. In a case where a complaint by a taxpayer is perhaps set aside by the Office of the Ombud, what other review processes are available?
Okay. If the taxpayer is not happy with the way in which the matter was dealt with, or the decision taken by the Tax Ombud, there's a review process within. Now, let me just explain what happens when a complaint comes to us. We investigate the matter, check whether it falls within the mandate, and for quality purposes, every complaint that we receive has to go through a committee. And that committee is, the committee members are people with legal background, with tax background, and so forth. Now, they sit and they look at every single complaint. It does happen that a decision is taken by the committee that the matter does not fall within the mandate. And the tax practitioner who is representing the taxpayer, or it may be the taxpayer for that matter, may say, well, I don't agree with that. Can it be reviewed? Now, when that happens, we send that complaint now to a different committee within the Office of the Tax Ombud, which may comprise of myself and other senior management team within the office. So we re-evaluate that complaint. It does happen that a taxpayer, the first committee maybe gets it wrong. So we do have a two-tier process. So you can also get a taxpayer may say, I'm not happy, please relook, and then we may either agree with the first committee or disagree with the first committee. It has happened in the past. Just like you do have in courts.
Yes.
You have an appeals process, and a higher court may come to a different conclusion to that which was arrived at by the earlier court or the lower court.
Well, an advocate, there's quite a lot. At this point, can you please share with us some of the major successes of your office? I know that it's not been around for a very long time, but I'm sure you've had your hands full in the time that you have started to operate.
Yes, we've helped a number of taxpayers. And the major successes, let me talk about some of the successes that we had in regard to specific taxpayers. A taxpayer had a request for suspension of payment, and that was positive. SARS had given the suspension of payment. But in a subsequent period, the taxpayer had a refund. So when that happened, naturally the taxpayer should have expected to receive the refund, because the other debt cannot be enforced because there's a request for suspension of payment. But that's not what happened with SARS. There was a debt equalization. So the taxpayer could not get his refund, meaning that in a way SARS enforced payment by taking away that amount. So we intervened, showed SARS that it's incorrect. There's a request for suspension of payment, which you granted, but you should not have collected the money or refused to refund the taxpayer. So with our intervention, the taxpayer got the money, got the refund, and we're talking a large sum of money. It ran into millions, and recently there was a taxpayer. Another example: the taxpayer was in a refund position over about 4 or 5 periods. Now, each time the return was submitted, SARS stopped the earlier refund, which was already approved to be refunded, and because of the next return that came in, SARS did not refund the taxpayer. The third return came in while they were looking at the second refund, and still the taxpayer could not get the first refund or the second refund. The fourth refund return was submitted in the process. So it was, the amount was accumulating, and the taxpayer was even almost at the verge of closing the business because they just could not cope with that. And the taxpayer was almost saying, well, if I do not get any help, next week I'm going to get the employees, I'm going to tell them I'm closing down. And so we intervened, and the taxpayer got the refunds. Now, we can safely say in that regard, we even helped, we saved the company from closing down, and we highlighted this issue as problematic because we found that there was no legal basis of SARS conduct in that regard.
That was substantial, advocate, yes, considering the social ramification also, yeah, and also the economic implications.
That is correct. So now we're talking specific taxpayers who had to go through this, and the assistance that they got from the office. But overall, we also do make formal recommendations to SARS on issues that we pick up. Typical example, I'll give the letters of demand did not comply with the requirements of the Act, and we pointed out to SARS, and of course they had to change the letters of demand. So we try to make sure that if we identify certain weaknesses within SARS, we can highlight that and they can change so that they also can comply with what the law says. So those are some of the things we've, in regard to suspension of payment, we had led, it has been one of the recommendations that we made previously, that they should look at making sure that the system is built in such a way that you can pick up that there's a request for suspension of payment, so that you don't debt equalize when such suspension of payment had been granted to the taxpayer.
In
the event that there's a refund, I'm sorry about it, in the event that there's a refund in the subsequent period. So as maybe you probably know now, that SARS has implemented, has upgraded its systems to be able to have this, you can pick it up on the system that there's a request for suspension of payment, and with effect from May this year, so that that problem should no longer happen.
So you do not have a case where the one side of SARS does not know what the other is doing. Yes, no, that's quite.
So we do make formal recommendations. It may relate, some of them relate to letters of objections that were confusing taxpayers, So, so those are some of the major successes. And, some of the other things that I can mention is that we managed to give input into legislative changes. In fact, we made proposals, because when you've come in after the act was passed, you may pick up that there are certain weaknesses in the act, and that we've made proposals for legislation to be amended. I can safely spell out to the viewers that the way the office was designed, there were certain weaknesses. For example, the way we appointed people. Or maybe let me start, with the term of the Ombud. You had a term of 3 years. 3 years, it's very short.
Yes.
Better to look at some of the other ombuds and look at the terms. Usually it's about 5 years. The public protector will be 7 years, and other jurisdictions outside here, do not even have a fixed term. So we amended that. We proposed that it be amended to 5 years from 3 years. And then how we appointed staff, we had to, in the first place, consult with the commissioner at the appointment stage by saying that this is what the Act said.
Yes.
That we had to appoint in consultation with the commissioner, meaning that there must be agreement between the tax ombud and the commissioner.
Noting that impinge on your independence somewhat.
It did, impact on our independence. We're not saying that commissioner ever did or stopped the ombud from appointing anybody.
Yes.
But you cannot have it legislated along those lines, because doing so depends on the goodwill of the parties.
Yes.
So if the commissioner decides, no, I don't like the person you want to appoint, he may stop. And rightfully so. He may say, legally, he may be correct, but we remove that element from the legislation. So we appoint our people with no consultation with the commissioner. Now, the third thing was that, which compromised our independence, was the funding.
Yes.
The Act specifically said, believe you me, that the expenditure connected with the operation of this office must be paid out of the funds of SARS. Now, that meant that SARS, in a way, could say, well, we don't agree with this expenditure, or we won't pay for this expenditure. So that would impact on our independence. So what we did was to propose that it be amended. After all, we report to the minister, so the budget should be determined by the minister. So it was changed, amended, to say that the expenditure connected with the office of the tax ombud shall be paid out of the budget determined by the minister, so which has given us independence. Now, the other issue is not independence, it's just to give us a wider mandate, the ability to initiate systemic investigations, obviously with the approval of the minister, so which was absent in the initial mandate. We were only limited to investigate issues on a case-by-case basis. So those are some of the successes. And lastly, the issues of recommendations that we make to SARS. The Act said they are not binding, and it was just full stop. So we made a proposal that in as much as they may not be binding, but there must be an obligation on the part of SARS to respond. If where they don't agree, where SARS does not agree with our recommendations, it must say so, and not just 10 months later or whatever. It must say so within 30 days of receiving a recommendation that it does not wish to implement those recommendations. It must state the full reasons, and that is a reportable issue, by the way. We can report that in the annual report to Parliament. And as you know, Parliament is supposed to hold these institutions to account. So SARS may be well called upon to explain why it does not implement the recommendations of the Tax Ombud by the Portfolio Committee.
Well, this is quite substantial, Advocate, and I think it's commendable that in such a short space of time since the inception of this office, you managed to iron out some of these teething problems. I think they were just teething problems, you know.
Well, we will say, yeah, the weaknesses in the legislation.
Yes, yes.
Really compromising our independence.
Yes.
But that's not all. We definitely will be looking at improving this institution. I just hope the viewers and can bear with us, because we want to build an institution that is credible, an institution that is not just independent or look independent, but is independent in all respects.
Yes.
There are certain weaknesses. I may not touch on that now. Maybe when we talk about where to from now.
Yes.
That's when I can talk.
Yeah, perhaps we can deal with that at a later stage as well. Advocate, we've got a lot of chartered accountants at SAICA who are members of our institute who practice as tax practitioners, and by definition they are intermediaries. Now, in the context of the current administrative laws, there are certain limitations in how they interact with SARS on a day-to-day basis. In your mandate as the Office of the Ombud, do you envisage getting involved in trying to ease some of these processes, also in how they can get involved directly in assisting taxpayers in addressing some of the issues with your office?
Yes. With practitioners, for example, there's an arrangement with SARS that they can make appointments and the like. With SARS, when they want to go in and deal with certain issues relating to their taxpayers, they too can be able to approach us. Say, for example, SARS does not honor those appointments. Isn't it service? It is service at the end of the day. So they encounter problems in that kind of arrangement. It's something that they can always raise with the Office of the Tax Ombud, because it relates to service. So we do, our mandate really can extend to that. A person may well say, I've been to SARS following, I've made an appointment, I was only given half an hour, and when I arrived there, maybe SARS did not honor and the like. Or maybe if it turns out to be a common issue, we can definitely deal with that. But now coming to our office as to whether we can provide a similar service to that of SARS in that regard. So far, we can't say we've seen or the need for it, because we don't have as many walk-ins as one would imagine, or would want, or similar to that, in SARS. So anybody who comes in here, they don't have to wait. They will be attended to immediately. So far we haven't really seen the need to have a dedicated line. But maybe there may be time may come at some stage to requiring us to do that. We can look at. And if people feel, the practitioners feel strongly that they need to have a dedicated line, we definitely may consider that. But obviously, so far, like I say, a person walks in, they will be attended to immediately, almost immediately.
Yes.
We don't have a large inflow of people wanting to be attended along those lines.
Just to clarify this issue further, Advocate, you mentioned earlier in our conversation that a taxpayer can approach you directly. Now, does that mean strictly that, or do intermediaries have the ability to approach you in their agency capacity?
The intermediaries are can do so. They can approach us.
Okay.
Of course, there's similar requirements that they have with SARS would apply here. Because of confidentiality, we need to know that the person is duly authorized
Yes.
by the taxpayer to do that. So we need a power of attorney.
Yes.
And where there are directors and the like, we need copies of the IDs and the like. So we need to protect the taxpayers. So as long as we are satisfied that this person is duly authorized, we do communicate with that person.
Yes. Earlier you mentioned that when you talked about the ability to initiate an investigation, that you would need permission of the minister. Now, Advocate, in our conversation, it's very clear that you've done a lot in strengthening the independence and effectiveness of your office. Now, do you think having to go to the minister is an ideal situation, or it's something that perhaps you might want to reconsider?
Well, look, it is, I would not say is the ideal situation, in the sense that sometimes you get entangled, can easily get entangled in this, in the relationship between the minister and the commissioner. Mm-hmm. So if I may give an example, it depends. Sometimes it depends on the relationship between the commissioner and the minister. You don't also want the perception given to the public that the minister does this simply because of his relationship with the commissioner, or because you need, once you appoint a tax ombud, you should have full confidence that the ombud would act in terms of the law. To get an approval for every investigation, it may just simply be cumbersome, not only to the minister but to the ombud. So that, I may say, it's not ideal. It's something that we need to reconsider. Not necessarily reconsider, make proposals on to probably remove that element of approval, requiring approval from the minister before initiating an investigation, a systemic investigation.
Well, we've almost come to the end of our discussion, Advocate. In conclusion, how do you see your office in the next 5 years?
Well, remember we are still in the establishment phase.
Yes.
We in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen what works, what doesn't work. So going forward, we have to revisit our mandate. We have to look at some of the things that we can improve on in regard to the mandate. Other jurisdictions, for example, you find the taxpayer has gone through some tough hardship because of the treatment they receive from the revenue authority. And under those circumstances, they are able to be compensated. We're not saying that that's a route that we want to pursue, but I'm just giving an example. You can refine these things. Now, it may not be costing SARS financially, but it may be costing the taxpayer financially and hardship. Now, at the end of the day, an apology may not be sufficient, because we do insist, in extreme cases, SARS must send an apology to the taxpayer, and they've obliged. And so it may not be sufficient. Sometimes it's possible. It may well be necessary to say the taxpayer deserves to be compensated. But I'm just giving an example. There's some of the things that we may look at. We may need to look at, obviously that's subject to debate and the like. In the UK, for example, there is redress of some sort. In the US, there are orders that may be issued, for example, to the revenue authority to say under these circumstances, you cannot continue, or you should not continue with collections, collection process. So those are some of the things that we may need to look at, learning from others and refining so that we can have a better institution. The other issue that we want to look at is just making sure that it's an institution that is completely independent in all respects. It's an institution that has legal capacity, that it can contract and it can do certain things, can be an employer in its own right, and that's a weakness currently, you know. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at. Just making sure that we look at find the best model for this institution. Not just simply copying and pasting from other jurisdictions. It may work for those jurisdictions, but we have our own dynamics in this country. And so we must find a balance of what would be the best model for this country. And also, we need to look at improving on our technology. A person must be able to go online and lodge a complaint online, and without producing a paper. So far, now you have to complete the form, sign it, and fax it, or mail it, or post it. We want to be able to enable a taxpayer in future. Improve on our technology to an extent that they can just simply lodge a complaint online, and that's the end of the story. We want to improve on our effectiveness. You know, when you start in office, you will make mistakes.
Yes.
You will, just like a toddler. You can't stand up and walk and not fall. You definitely will fall as a child. And but that doesn't mean, you should never go forward.
Yes.
We'll make mistakes. We want to also get input from tax practitioners.
Yes.
What do they see? Get feedback, conduct surveys, and see what is it that we can do to make sure that we are effective. And we'll also want to see the footprint, expansion of our footprint. We don't want to just see ourselves in Pretoria. We want a taxpayer in Durban to be able to walk to the office in Durban, perhaps in Cape Town. So yes, of course, all those require funding.
Yes.
And if all those things can be improved, definitely we'll be able to be much more effective. Yes, we want everyone to know that there's a tax ombud.
Yes.
Because so far, we still find we've done a lot of work, I must say, within a short space of time. But that's not sufficient. There's still a lot who don't know that it's even an office of the Tax Ombud. And I always joke with my colleagues who are doing communication that I should never be in any place where I hear people have never heard of the Tax Ombud. So I want the whole country to know. All the taxpayers should know that if they are not happy with SARS, there's an office called the Office of the Tax Ombud. And we want that.
Yes.
And they must know the mandate, and not just to know it, but to know it thoroughly. Yes. So that's just really our strategy in the 5-year strategy.
Yeah. Well, Advocate, thank you so much. It's been very enlightening, and I think a great pleasure to have you here. I look forward to work closely with you in future from an RCB point of view in the nation's interest. I'm sure we have a lot to cover. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir.